So that was 7 seconds. What'd you think about that? What were some of the assumptions that you made about me, or how about this talk was going to go? Some of you might have been curious, a little bit intrigued. Some of you might have just thought, I think this guy might have forgotten his lines. Or some of you have been making the right decision and thought to yourself, is this guy really wearing basketball shoes to a TEDx talk? I don't think that's the right choice. Regardless, hold that assumption for just a little while longer. Now let's shift gears. Think back to a teacher, a good friend, maybe even your best friend, or maybe just that Starbucks barista that you see every other week. I'm sure we all have one of those. Think back to the first time you've seen them. What were they wearing? Was it a jacket, a shirt? What color was it? Red, blue, black, green, white? Were they standing up? Were they sitting down? Were they slouched a little bit or stood straight up? How fast were they talking? Were they talking so fast that you can understand them, or were they talking slow and meticulous, where you clung to every word that they spoke? That seems like a lot to think about right now, but at the moment, you were able to make a judgment. And with that, you concocted a way in which you could approach them. It could have gone something like this. That person over there looks really friendly. I should go talk to them sometime. Or it could have been something like this. That person looks like they're taking this 10-point assignment a little too seriously. I think I'm just going to stay away from them for now. But if there's a project I need to do, and I need a partner, I know who to talk to. Or whenever we wake up on the wrong side of the bed, I'm sure we've looked at someone from across the room and thought, that person's already under my skin. The Toby to my Michael Scott. On a near daily basis, we make these types of judgments under quite basic headings such as aggressive, friendly, or awkward. And these happen so often every single day that they've become ingrained in our everyday actions and routines. And because they've been ingrained, we tend to forget that they're there. And yet, there is an underlying power and significance to our first impressions, and unbeknownst to us, these factors and these judgments are shaping the ways our futures are formed, our relationships, and our actions. I come from a quite common position as a new kid at school. I wasn't from any of the local middle schools where most first impressions were formed, and whether right or wrong, fair or unfair, you mostly decided how you're going to perceive each other. I came from the district over, and I always looked at this school as the academic supergiant, the home of the perfect SAT, the home of that 5.0. So when I sat down for my first freshman class, I adopted a plan many of you are familiar with: eat, sleep, study, repeat. Do the same thing day in and day out. But with this adoption of this plan came an unintended negligence of my concerns about my first impressions. On a basic level, I knew that I was giving off this first impression of this nerdy, standoffish first impression, and I really didn't care. And that stayed that way for about 3 years until I joined the student newspaper, where I was forced to meet new people that would become my co-workers of a sense. And when I started talking to them, a lot of them, a little bit too many of them, thought I was intimidating and scary and stoic and cold. And as the slim Asian guy that I am, I never really thought of myself as imposing or intimidating. And with my dejected and admittedly a little bit offended self, I came to an epiphany. We should be giving a consideration to our first impressions, because more often than not, the message we are trying to deliver to the world is not the same message being received. We try and make these types of judgments under a multitude of factors, and it's quite difficult to put them into place. According to Forbes, our minds make computations like these at near lightning speeds, making major decisions about one another in the first 7 seconds of meeting. Think back to the first 7 seconds of this very talk. What are some of the assumptions that you made? Did you make a decision whether you were going to be invested in this talk, or maybe doze off until the next one? A good way to visualize this idea is through a book. Let's say that you go to Barnes & Noble's and you skim the aisles, and you find that one book that has that intriguing cover. You decide to pick it up, and you look through the first few pages of the couple hundred pages that might be part of it. No, just based upon our first impressions of the front cover and those first few pages, we'll make a judgment on the entirety of the book, and we'll make a decision whether to put it down and wait again, or pick it up, invest ourselves into it, and decide to read on. And although it might seem a little bit far-fetched, we use this same type of calculus with people in our everyday lives. The front cover and the first few pages to us may become multitudes of different things. It can be how people speak, how people stand, how tall they are, how they dress. These are just some of the factors at play when we make these types of judgments, and these factors have become ingrained in us through personal preferences over years, even decades for some of you. And these types of factors are almost unchangeable. They're unchangeable in a sense that you cannot make yourself immediately alter the factors at play. You just can't wake up one day and think to yourself, oh, I suddenly like people that aggressively yell whenever they talk. No, it doesn't work like that. Instead, we maintain this intricate balance within our own minds that's influenced with every event, big or small, that's ever changing, but ever so slightly. A good way to rationalize this idea is through a simple rule. We reflect on our good relationships, and we'll seek out people that demonstrate those characteristics in an attempt to emulate the benefits of the past. But that very same philosophy works in the opposite direction. We'll reflect on our negative experiences, our negative relationships, and we'll knowingly or unknowingly start to evade people that demonstrate those characteristics in an attempt to avoid the consequences of the past. A good way to visualize and remember this type of idea is just to think back to a relationship. Let's say that you've had a relationship with someone that seemed overly happy but turned out to be superficial. Now, whenever we'll meet overly happy people within our lives, in the back of our heads, we'll be thinking to ourselves that this new person might harbor that same level of superficiality, making us hesitant to even talk to them. And that's mainly how our first impressions work. They've become ingrained over years and years. But just because they're rigid and difficult to change, it doesn't mean they're unchallengeable. But they can't be overcome in a sense that you just can't ignore them. Instead, you have to learn how to work around them. The very same people in newspaper that thought I was cold and intimidating and stoic turned out to be some of the best friends that I've ever met in all 12 years of my schooling. And they were gracious enough to give me a second chance. Now, at the time, I thought to myself, oh, I'm just that great of a person. I deserved that second chance. They made the mistake. They misunderstood me. And it was not my fault in the slightest. But it wasn't until at that very same publication that I was forced to make a decision to acknowledge this very same lesson. While I was beginning, I didn't know the ropes of writing an article, so I was usually given a list of interviewees to go talk to that would be pertinent to the subject. And for the most part, I would look at the names and it would be different to them. I could talk to them for about 20 to 30 minutes and leave satisfied with the answers I would get. It wasn't until my third issue when I got the list and I looked at one of the names. I'd seen him around campus, and based on my first impressions of him, he was lacking in ideal character, maturity, and eloquence required for a good article in an esteemed paper. So I begrudgingly set up the interview, and I sat down, loathing the self-pick response that I would get from him. And I sat down, and I asked the first question. But something happened. His eyes lit up. His interest peaked. And out came this surprisingly genuine and detailed response from him with intricate ideas and opinions. And I remember sitting there after the interview, shocked. Shocked just not by the response. No, I was ecstatic. I got the perfect quote. And that article turned out to be one of the best things I've ever written in the year and a half that I've been part of it. No, I was shocked because reality came into direct contrast with my first impressions of him. And for the first time, I was forced to look my mistakes in the eye and realize my first impressions were wrong. I was wrong. In an age of Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, first impressions seem to matter to us more than ever. And admitting that is quite difficult. Admitting that appearance matters to us. Admitting that how people speak matters to us. Admitting that how we think someone will contribute to a conversation matters to us. Most people make the mistake in thinking that by acknowledging this truth, it makes them shallow or self-centered, when quite the opposite is true. By acknowledging the ingrained nature of how our first impressions operate within our own minds, we as people, with our own character and our own will, can become more cautious of how we judge others. Even if we may seem awkward or anxious to someone, we can be seen as reserved or down to earth to others. Regardless, there's something more to that person than just your first impression. Now I would figure to think back to that teacher, that friend, that barista, and I would argue that it's so difficult to remember that first impression because there's so many more years of experience and interactions built upon that first impression to the point where it seems almost insignificant, and it's easy to brush off the influence of that first impression. But now, I ask you, think to someone you've seen around your campus, your community, that you've never talked to based upon how you saw them the first time. Maybe you didn't like their hair or how they dressed or how they talked or how they acted. Just based upon that, you decided to exclude them from your own life. And you missed out on all the other years of experience, interactions you gave others. So now I ask you, knowing what you know about how first impressions may operate within your own life, do you have the confidence to challenge your first impressions of others and give someone in your life a second chance? Thank you.